Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of the SIOP Living History Series. My name is Jeff Cucina. I'm a personal research psychologist with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and I'm currently serving as the SIOP historian or history committee chair. And for the past several years, at each SIOP conference, we've held a living history session where we have interviewed historical prominent I.O. figures, including David Campbell, Paul Thayer. Last year we interviewed Frank Schmidt. There's probably no better way to learn about the early activities of SIOP than listening to our early contributors' experiences. So today we are having our fourth installment, and we will be interviewing Edwin, Locke, and Gary Latham. So Edwin Locke is a professor emeritus at University of Maryland. Gary Latham is the Secretary of State Professor of Organizational Effectiveness at the Rotman School of Management in the University of Toronto. You're probably familiar with their goal-setting theory. That was recently named as the most important management theory out of 73 contending theories. Each of them have over 200 publications. Locke has 320 publications. In total, they've been cited 81,000 times, according to Harting's Publisher Parish program. In 2005, APS stated that Locke was the most published organizational psychologist ever. Both have been identified by Posikoff as being in the 99th percentile for citations, and they've won numerous awards and honors. So both of them won the APS Cattell Fellow Award. Both received the Herbert Henneman Jr. Award for Career Achievement in the HRD Division of Academy of Management. Both have received the Lifetime Achievement Award for the Organizational Behavior Division of Academy of Management. They both received SIOP's Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. Gary Latham is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he is also the only person who has received both the Distinguished Contributions to Psychology as a Profession and as a Science Award from SIOP. And of course, they're both fellows of APA, SIOP, APS, and Academy of Management. So very pleased to have them here today. So the way the session is, we're going to kind of go through their careers, and we're lucky enough to have both of them here. They publish a lot together. We submitted this for the SIOP review process, and we got a lot of interesting reviewer comments. One of them said, after taking a lot of notes from the submission, I simply thought to myself, this is a no-brainer. Absolutely have a session with Locke and Latham. In fact, you should serve refreshing beverages and have dancing afterwards. Unfortunately, we're not going to have any beverages or dancing, but we do have Locke and Latham. So we'll start with you, Ed. So you grew up in New York City, and then you got your bachelor's degree from Harvard University, correct? Mm-hmm. Then you went on and got your MA and PhD degrees in industrial psychology, minoring in industrial sociology at Cornell. So what led you to become an I.O. psychologist?
By the way, if you can't hear in the back, raise your hand, because I've been sitting in the back in a lot of sessions and couldn't hear anything. So I want to make sure you get proper volume from here. So if you can't hear, just feel free to raise your hand. So I majored in psychology at Harvard, but it was pretty much rat psychology and Freud. And my advisor was Richard Herrnstein, who you might have heard of the name. He's became notorious as the co-author of The Bell Curve. But this is way later. And so I told him, I said, I'm not quite sure what to do, because my father's, at the time, was a successful businessman, although he didn't end up that way. And I said, but I like psychology, but I don't like rats. So he said, why don't you combine the two and study industrial psychology? And I said, I'd never heard of it. What is it? So he explained it to me and said, apply to Cornell, which I did and got admitted. And am I ahead of myself from Pat Smith?
Go ahead.
So Pat Smith was one of the pioneer women industrial psychologists. It was kind of interesting politically, because she was a socialist and I was a capitalist. But in fairness, she treated me well. She really did. So I had a good professional relationship.
Are you voting for Bernie?
She'd be voting for Bernie, and I'm voting for nobody. And my inspiration for goal setting was she and Tom Ryan, another faculty member, wrote one of the first industrial psychology textbooks, and in it was a study by C.A. Mace, 1935 in England, on goal setting. The only study that I'd ever heard of. I never knew what it was. And I thought this was really, really interesting. And then Ryan was writing a book on goals and intentions, which he published later, which did not become a hit because it was during the behaviorist period. But I did my dissertation on intentions and performance, and that's how I got started, because I thought what C.A. Mace is doing is important. And Ryan had said, if you want to explain motivation, start with the immediate causes, and then later build into the remote causes, such as traits. So I thought that was good advice, and that's how I got started.
Great. And then after graduating from Cornell, you started working for the American Institutes for Research. So what type of work were you doing at AIR?
Ed Fleischman was running that office, and he put me in touch with the Office of Naval Research. I got a grant to study goal setting. So I was very happy to have that support. It had a funny ending. After 2 years, they cut me off, and sort of privately, I inquired, why was this? I got really good results. And they said, well, here's the problem. They said, but don't publish this. Your stuff came out. So we had to cut you off because we could justify the money we gave you. But a lot of our stuff doesn't come out, so we have to keep spending money on them. There's a positive reward system if you ever heard of one. So then I got a feeler from the University of Maryland, and I realized I wouldn't have to be so dependent on grants. And they had an opening, so that's when I joined the psychology department. Then I had a fight with the head of the IO Psych program, and he said, there's an opening in the business school, maybe you should look at it. So I did, and I got the job, and I was joint. And then I was 50-50, then I was 40-60, then I was 35-65, then I was 25-75, and I ended up full-time in the business school. So it all worked out for me, despite the setback. So that's how I got to the business school and retired from there in 2001. But I didn't retire from writing. Okay.
Great. So we'll move on to Gary Latham. So Gary,
that picture was taken only 2-3 years ago.
So you were born in Nova Scotia, and then you later moved to Massachusetts. And so you got your bachelor's degree in experimental psychology in 1967, and then you went to Georgia Tech and got a master's in social industrial psychology, and then a PhD at the University of Akron in 1974. And you said that there was a strong behaviorism slant in your undergrad university, correct?
Yes. Yes. Is there a question there, or is that just a comment?
Just a comment. You want to
condemnation. Yeah, there was a strong, I'm a Canadian, and I went to Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, and in that era, it was a bastion for behaviorism. And in addition, all our courses in psych required laboratories. And so I just got totally enthralled with research. To this day, there is nothing that excites me more than doing an experiment and then going, wow, it worked, who would have guessed? Or, darn, it didn't work, I wonder why, and then doing another and another. So I've always credited Dalhousie for being the source of my passion. I didn't have particularly good grades. I didn't like high school. I didn't much like university either until I took Psych 200 with the laboratories, and from there on, I've never left and do research for research's sake.
Thanks. So can you tell us the story of Tom, the waiter, and how he inspired your career?
Sadly, I don't recall the person's last name. He was a student at Boston University, and I was just finished my junior year in high school. My parents moved my senior year. I only decided to forgive them about a week ago. And of course, I left the love of my life behind. So I was washing dishes in the back of Friendly Ice Cream. If anyone's from New England, you'll know about Friendly's. And gee, I'm even getting an applause for that, huh? Well, you wouldn't have applauded me if you saw the way I washed the dishes. But this person, Tom, who I believe was second year at BU, walked in the back, and out of the blue he said, "You know, you used to be such a nice guy, and now you're not. And what happened?" So I told him about my girlfriend. My parents had taken me away because of the move. And he said, "Have you ever thought about psychology?" And I honestly, this would be 1962, I had never heard of the word. I certainly knew psychiatry and psychiatrists, but I'd never heard of the word psychology. So I asked him, "What's that?" And from there on, I was hooked. And when I arrived at Dalhousie, I decided that psychology would be my major. And it was, I was subsequently elected years later president of the Canadian Psych Association, and the meeting happened to be in Halifax. So I'm standing here before 1,000 or so people, and I say, it's no surprise that I was elected president. I knew in '63 that one day I would stand here. It was my highest grade by far, 55.
I have another Tom story, Tom the waiter story, and you were there. This is kind of funny. So in those days, Hertzberg's theory was famous, and one of his premises was that money's only a demotivator. So Gary and I don't know if it was SIOP or APA, went to the World Trade Center, when it was still there, went to the top to have dinner. So the waiter came over and we said, we've been told in a session we just were at that money is only a demotivator, so is it okay if we don't give you a tip? So you can imagine the reaction. We were just kidding him. But it was a funny waiter experience.
We haven't been back since, and obviously won't be.
We gave him a tip.
So Gary, can you tell us what led you to become an IO psychologist?
Well, I was, I believe, the first and only undergraduate student to be asked to serve as a research assistant. And this is a picture of my mentor, Dr. Horace. His nickname was Ace Beach. And he was a clinical psychologist and a great mentor. And he would get me involved with his clients. And one day he called me in and said, "So Gary, what would you," he was a cognitive behavioral mod kind of guy. And he said, "What would you recommend we do with this person?" I said, "I'd drown him in the Halifax Harbor." So I think that was a clue that maybe I wasn't cut out for clinical psychology. So we had a lab, and maybe it was the very next day, I walked into the lab, and there was an article on my desk by Brayfield and Crockett on job satisfaction and performance. So I read it, and then I really got excited, and I raced into Dr. Beach's. Nobody was called by their first name in those days, and I raced into Dr. Beach's office. I said, Dr. Beach, you need to read this article. I think I want to become," and in those days there was not organizational, it was just industrial psychology. "So I think I want to become an industrial psychologist." So he sat me down, and you can guess who would put the article on the table. And he said, "Gary, I think it's time that you pursue that career." And so he helped me get into graduate school and what have you, and I've never deviated or regretted that decision.
Can you tell us about your doctoral work? Who was your advisor? What was your dissertation topic?
Oh, well, you need to know, before I went to University of Akron for my doctorate, I worked 2 years for the American Pulpwood Association, which was just fantastic because I got to apply and do research on the things that I had learned as an undergraduate and as a master's student. Then I went to Akron, and I had Gary Uckel and Ken Wexley who were mentors. And what was great about them, a number of things. One was they weren't all that much older than I, and they were assistant professors pursuing tenure. And there's nothing like working with young faculty who want pubs. So I just told you how much I love doing research. Wexley was very much an industrial psychologist, and that's what I already had been exposed to at Georgia Tech. Uckel opened my eyes to organizational psychology. And every week we had to have these debates, whether you were pro-Maslow or con-Maslow or pro-Vroom and expectancy theory, con-expectancy theory. And I got turned on by this, the readings by this young guy who did laboratory experiments, and he showed that more arithmetic problems were solved, or more Tinker Toys were made, or more anagrams were solved if the experimental condition had specific high goals. And as I recall, his name was Ed Locke.
That's right.
It is Ed Locke.
Yeah, that's right.
What a shock to find out I've been wrong all these years.
So you did your dissertation involving some goal setting, correct?
Yeah, one of the people who influenced me as a student was Rensis Lickert, who at the time was at the University of Michigan. And he had just come out with a book. Oh, I just went blank on it. The Human Organization, 1967, The Human Organization. And his theory, his Systems 4 theory, focused on 3 variables: participation in decision-making, the principle of supportive relationships between the boss and the employee or the team, and goal setting. So I already knew what my dissertation was going to be on, goal setting. So I decided I wanted to look at participative goal setting versus assigned goal setting, and that actually led to programmatic research on my part for probably a decade.
So you went to the University of Akron, and then after only a year and a half, you took your oral exams, and then the day after the oral exams, you started at Weyerhaeuser, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Where's the question in that?
So what type of work were you doing at Weyerhaeuser, and then how did you balance your dissertation and grad school responsibilities?
Well, you know, in the 80s, Bandura published an article in the American Psychologist on serendipity. And in many ways, my life has benefited from serendipity. At the American Pulpwood Association, the Weyerhaeuser Company had found out about me pretty quickly because it's pulp and paper, logging, that sort of thing. And they were tracking me while I was at the University of Akron. I had no idea, but that's what they were. And one day, I got a phone call saying, "How would you like to come to work for us?" And I said, "Well, I haven't even taken comps yet. I haven't done my dissertation. I'm sorry, I can't do that." And so they said, "Well, when are you going to take comps?" And I said, "Well, I take them in April, but most people fail them first time around." He said, "Well, don't fail them. We want you here no later than, and we will let you do your dissertation on any subject you wish." Now, here's where serendipity came. In addition, when I arrived, and I was only, I think, 27, they said, "You'll report to the Vice President of Human Resources, but you will be evaluated on the types of things you choose to do." So I had carte blanche. So I got involved in performance appraisals. The only bad experience I had a phone call on 4:30 on a Friday saying, "We want you in Arkansas on Sunday." Now, with all due respect to the Clintons, show of hands, how many of you are desperate to go to Arkansas on Sunday? And they said, what we want you to do, we just bought this sawmill from the International Paper Company. Tell us which employees we should keep and which ones we should let go. Now, I'm thinking, how the heck am I supposed to know? Depends on their height or their weight. So I started drinking Manhattans on the rocks. I still do, did last night. And I had to fly from Seattle to St. Louis and then St. Louis to Hot Springs. And I was thinking how life was good when I was doing critical incident technique analyses at the American Pulpit Association. And then serendipity struck. I came up with, over the second Manhattan, what would happen if I gave people situations and then asked them what they would do? And intentions predict behavior. And bingo, by the time I got on the plane, I had developed what is known as the situational interview. That's the genesis for that. Then we had wildcat strikes, and I was very close to and influenced by Mal Sorcher, and he had just published, I think in Personnel Psych, an article on behavioral modeling. Now, I knew about Bandura and Bobo dolls and that sort of thing, but I was fascinated by, and I think Sorcher got the very first professional distinguished contributions to psychology as a profession. So that was back in the 70s. Paul Thayer can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 77. So I did behavioral modeling training with first-line supervisors to teach them how to problem solve and work with and improve their interpersonal skills working with hourly workers and with the union hierarchy. And then, of course, as you well know, if you know anything, anything about my work, Locke's work was being criticized by a number of very respected people in our field for being laboratory-based. And the assumption was, and I can almost give you the quote, that something so simple and straightforward as telling people to set specific high goals in the workplace is just going to be, for lack of a better word, trivial. Well, I had done some surveys with loggers. And in those days, you know, everything goes in a fad. In the 50s, it was arguments over fixed, mixed, and random analyses of variance. And now everybody wants to argue about degrees of freedom and structural equation modeling. But in my day, it was damn factor analysis with a Frieden calculator. So, it was heck. So with this factor analysis, I had, this is before reading Locke's work, I found that on a factor where there was lots of supervision but no goal setting, it didn't load with objective measures of productivity, cords of wood divided by employee hours. And this is a very objective criterion. And if you had goal setting and lots of supervision, it loaded on the same factor with productivity. So I'm saying to the Weyerhaeuser managers, look, this is going to be relatively unobtrusive. We're just going to randomly assign to conditions, and let's see what happens. And next thing you know, I was doing goal-setting experiments all over Weyerhaeuser, whether it was word processing operators, engineer scientists, truck drivers. Everybody wanted Gary to come and do a goal setting. Oh, and I also got credit in the process for inventing a control group. So I would get senior VPs writing, "Dear Gary, I think we found a control group for you in North Carolina. Can you get down here right away?"
And there's a serendipitous aspect to this, because I got sort of annoyed at the lab field thing, and the head of JAP was adamant that lab studies shouldn't be published because they don't generalize. And so as an inductive scientist, I said, well, how do we actually know that that's true? So I ended up editing an entire book on the subject, generalizing from lab to field studies, published in '86, in which I asked experts in every aspect of biopsych to look at the literature. in their specialty areas. And it generalizes. In all the areas, lab and field generalize pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty well. So that was, and then again, I was inductive. So how do we know that claim is true and the editor was wrong? So that was kind of fun.
Ask us at break, we'll tell you. Names.
The guy whose editor is dead, so.
So's the associate editor.
So in 1983, Gary, you became a professor at the University of Washington. What led you to switch to academia?
Oh, well, I'd been a full-time consultant from 76 to 83, and Fred Fiedler and Terry Mitchell were very kind to me. Terry was in the business school and Fred was in the psych department, and they had joint appointments. So they gave me an office, and while I would be doing consulting, I would be turning them into my consulting assignments into publishable research. And I was supporting doctoral students in my pursuit of research. And one day, the dean of the business school called me in, and I can't use the word because it's vulgar and this is being recorded. So Nancy Jacob called me in, sat me down in front of her, and she says, "Gary, it's time for you to bleep or get off the pot." And I said, "What does that mean?" She says, "I've got an opening and I want you to take it." She says, "You'll have to give a colloquium before the whole faculty, but if just one more person than Terry Mitchell votes for you, you're getting the job."
So can you tell us how the two of you met?
Oh, well, if you know Ed Locke, you know he is not suffering from ambiguity. Ed has strong opinions, and one of his strong opinions has to do with behaviorism. I wouldn't say he dislikes behaviorism. He loathes behaviorism. Now, not everyone agrees with Ed, and Mill Blood was one of them, and he organized a symposium on the application of operant principles in industry. I had, as you know, been subjected to operant methodology when I was at Dalhousie University, and one of the things that intrigued me were schedules of reinforcement and how they influence behavior differentially. So here's Mill Blood. He's got this symposium. I've just spoken on the subject, and in walks this urbane, blonde-haired, well-dressed, tie, missing today,
Oops.
but good-looking guy. And then he walks and he says, "Gary?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I'm Ed Locke." And we've been an odd couple ever since. Needless to say, I'm Oscar.
So can you tell us about your first publication together, 1975?
Well, I had actually loads and loads of data that I still hadn't analyzed from my days at the American Pulpwood Association. And now I was at Weyerhaeuser. As I said, my time was my own. I was being assessed on the value of the projects that I chose to work on. And Ed had done laboratory research showing around Parkinson's law. And how did Parkinson's law go? Work expands to the time limit allowed.
Work expands to fill the time available.
Yeah, that's it. And I had found, just based on observation, that when the pulp and paper companies would restrict the amount of wood they would buy to, say, 3 days versus 5 days, that's because the loggers who supply wood to the companies are independent pulpwood crews. They're not employees of the company. These people are paid on piece rate. So when you restrict the days that people can sell wood to these pulp and paper companies, you're restricting their income. So I decided, I got Ed involved, and I decided, let's look at what happens. And sure enough, when you restricted the amount of wood that you would buy from a pulpwood crew from 5 days to 3 days, they harvested as much in those 3 days as they normally did in 5. So we were showing how time limits serve as a specific high goal for employees in the workforce. So JAP grabbed it right away. This was our very first paper together.
Fascinating. So what's the typical collaboration process? Because you publish so frequently together. Do you have a typical way of doing things?
We really don't. Of course, Gary does study separately than me, and I do study separately from him. And then if we have an idea, we talk to each other about it and do something together. And over the years, we've gotten many, many invited articles and chapters. I think we had about 45 total, plus 2 books. And last year, I think he could say we've never had one rejected, but there is an exception, which was kind of funny. We wrote all this concern about academia and business, especially in business schools. So we wrote an article as to identifying the unpleasant fact that no businessman in his right mind would read our journals. It's insane. You can't even understand most of them. They're all statistics, all kinds of mediated moderation and complex and 12 tables following. And we said, well, there's a reason for this historically. Business school wanted to become respectable. How do you become respectable as an academic? You write articles for academics in academic journals. So that's what business schools do. And if you try to do applied articles, not only do you not get credit, you can have your career wrecked. Not because that's bad in itself, because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. So we wrote some ideas for improving business schools. How you could get them, Harvard's better at this than a lot of schools, how you can get them more attuned to the real world. And so we sent it to one of the management journals, not AMJ, but one of the other journals, and they rejected it because we didn't have a theory. So that's our only failure so far, but otherwise everything we've done together has been published. So we don't have a particular method. Sometimes one will come up with the idea and take charge, and another time the other will come up with the idea and take charge. We tend to delegate data analysis to graduate students and give them co-authorship. And of course, you have to be careful, but I know how to sort of read data analysis to see if anything doesn't look right. So I think we trusted them. Now, you might ask, do we argue? Hell yes, we do. But it's never personalized. Never personal attacks. So it's always disagreement about the paper, what's being said, that sentence, that approach, that title. And so it's constructive conflict.
Although one time, I think it's not too many years back, it was when we, SIOP met in New York City, whatever year that was. Anyway, he got me so upset, I decided that maybe I should phone his wife, Kathy, to intervene. I didn't, but came this close. So when we got in New York, I said, I almost called Kathy. And he looks at me with disbelief and says, I was about to phone your wife, Suzanne. And it was arguing about really significant stuff, whether the word should be this, not the sentence, just a single word.
But I think it's good that for 45 years, despite arguments, we kept the relationship professional. I mean, that's what's important. And we have different philosophies. We have different styles. I'm introverted. He's extroverted. But we kept the whole collaboration professional, and we also sustained a joint interest in the topic, which many people don't. So that's how we've lasted.
So and throughout much of your collaboration, you've been in separate cities or even separate countries, other than neighboring. Has that been a barrier to collaborating, or are you able to overcome that?
No. We have email, and emergencies, phone calls, and we come to conferences reasonably often. So
yeah, I actually think that the geographical distance has probably been a boon rather than a bust, because it keeps you from saying things in the heat of the moment you might wish you hadn't said at the time. So with emails and the occasional phone call, we can stay professional without slipping into an ad hominem remark like, how can you want this paragraph as opposed to that paragraph? What have you been drinking? Or
So you're probably best known for goal-setting theory. Can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration for working in this area for so long?
Well, observe, we started in different places. So I was inspired by Ryan and Smith's discussion of the C.A. Mace article written in 1935. And another serendipitous thing, he was still alive when I started this research. So when I went to England, I visited him, and he was terribly pleased that somebody had come back 30 years later with testing his ideas, because Mace never did a statistical test at all. So that's what, and then Ryan was writing a book on intentional behavior. So I got started that way, and Gary told you he got started in a different way.
In our field, we call ourselves scientist practitioners. However, my own self-description is I'm a practitioner scientist. So my passion is around application, not theory. And I think, although Ed and I are upset with the fetish of some of the editors in the recent past on theory, Ed's just a brilliant theoretician. And I seem to have the knack for being able to figure out how we could apply whatever it is, in this case goal setting, in the work setting. And so, as I said, in the very beginning, in 68, 69, we were doing factor analyses, and there would be goal setting. And then we'd do critical incident technique analyses. There would be goal setting. And one day, I just grabbed the stuff and brought it into Dr. Ronan and said, Dr. Ronan, look, here's what we find, and here's what this guy named Locke is doing in the laboratory. There seems to be something here. And so then experiment after experiment, we got both statistical significance and, more importantly, in my mind, practical significance. Well, then, what I find so exciting about research, as good as the findings are, there's always something that's left undone. So you don't say, hi, I'm Gary, I want to do programmatic research. It just happens. So you go, okay, well, this came out, but what about? All right, well, that's the next experiment. And then you go, but what about? And there's the next experiment. And of course, by this time, Ed and I are collaborating as of 74. The article came out in 75. And just through conversations back and forth and asking, what about? More research, more research, more research.
And it helped that it worked. Now, one of my negative exemplars was Frederick Hertzberg. He developed a theory based on 2 studies with one methodology, which was dubious, it's a critical incident thing, and fairly arbitrary interpretations. And then he stopped theorizing, except for another book on a theory of man, somehow derived from these 2 little studies. But he became, and then he was invited to APA for a symposium in which there was a discussion of his theory, which other people criticized. And he became enraged. And then he became enraged at Pat Smith because we published a study that didn't support. And his whole attitude was, these 2 studies are true, and everyone who criticizes me is bad. And I said to myself, and I saw him in functioning at APA and how bad that was, and I said, you know, this is not the way to build a theory. This is not the way to do this. Number one, you can't build a theory on 2 studies. And number two, you cannot attack people who find flaws in it because you need to replicate. Now, another issue where I disagree with the modern thing, direct replication, in my mind, is not useful. This is a big bugaboo. What you need is replication with variation. Direct replication means you've done the same study 100 times. So what? What can you generalize from one study done 100 times? That's ridiculous. So replication with variation, and I wrote about this in my article in Perspectives in Psychological Science, if you know the APS journals, is you're discovering mediators and you're discovering moderators, you're discovering generalizability across tasks and subjects and time spans and countries. And that enables you to develop an actual theory, which is a lot different than getting a hypothesis, one hypothesis, then pretending you have a theory to deduce it from, which is what the journals force you to do, then doing the study, and then revising your hypothesis and the deductions to make sure it's consistent with the results that you got by working backwards. You know how it works. It's a scandal. And he said, that's not the way to do it. It's not the way to do science. It's not right. So we got an approach, and people kept asking me, well, when are you going to write a theory? I said, not ready. Not ready. 25 years later, I said to Gary, I think we're ready. 25 years, 400 studies, not all done by us. So, and because of that, it's based on so much. It endures. Hertzberg theories disappeared, but it endures. It's because of not because we're geniuses, because of the methodology that we used, which is not what the journal editors want or even allow. Big mistake. Science is an inductive process primarily. The history of science is inductive. You look at laboratories. What do? They try stuff, like a drug laboratory. They try stuff. They look at the journals, let me try that. They read another journal, try that. Oh, that doesn't work, try something else. And eventually, they come up with something that's valid. So that's the way we work.
You know, just to add, there was no systematic approach on Ed and my part in terms of the order in which we did research, or we'll choose this now, we'll choose this over here later. It was just as stuff came up, or there'd be controversies in the literature back in the early to mid-'70s. What explains the improvement in performance? Is it the goals that are set, or is it feedback? And you had people like Larry Cummings and Judy Komaki saying it's definitely feedback, and so now we'd say, okay, rather than just argue back and forth, which is slightly a waste of time, argue and then do an experiment. So we now start doing experiments. What's the effect of feedback versus what's the effect of goal setting? And we found that goal setting is moderated by feedback, and feedback is mediated by goals. Well, how would we know that if we didn't do the research? And rather than just get in a huff because somebody's criticizing your work, embrace it and then test it. And for your junior faculty, it's another pub on your Vita.
And it's interesting in the, Judy Komaki was a fairly fanatic behaviorist who's now retired. I think she works writing plays on Broadway, so she has another career. And then I started, in addition to doing experiments, also looked at the literature, and we found feedback alone doesn't work. Why? Because you get feedback all day, your whole life. But which part do you act on? You act on the feedback that ties to a value or a goal, and the rest you ignore. So the principle that used to be famous, what gets measured gets done, isn't true. It's not true. Feedback tied to goals gets done. But feedback is just facts. You've got to evaluate the facts and then decide to act on them if you want the feedback to have any effect. So that was sort of a fun aspect of developing. In our 1990 book, we have an entire chapter summarizing that whole literature. And then we found from Merriam-Eyers that although feedback was a moderator, goals are a mediator of feedback, she found feedback was a moderator of goals. Because if you don't have feedback, you don't know if you're reaching your goals. So we noticed the building of the theory, the moderators and mediators. And instead of resenting Miriam, we said, great, we've learned something new. Mm-hmm. We've built it in. And I guess you're going to ask about our interesting dispute study. I never studied participation to speak of. Latham did, and Ayres did in Israel, and they got quite different results. Latham found it wasn't that crucial. It was the type of goal and the difficulty of the goal. Ayres found it had a big effect on performance. And I was good friends with both of them. And so we got together, said, what if I don't know how this worked. Was it your idea to do a joint thing?
I don't remember. It happened over dinner.
Yeah.
The three of us were having dinner. And again, rather than act like 5-year-olds going, I'm right, no, I'm right, and recognizing that Miriam was an excellent researcher, and I validated that by having my doctoral students, I gave them one goal: find the flaw in Miriam's research. I need a flaw. And adding an S will be even better, flaws. And we couldn't find any. And in a sentence, what she's showing is that goals that are set in a participative manner beat the heck out of goals that are assigned. And as I told you, one of my heroes was Rensis Lickard. So initially, I expected to support what Miriam was finding. But over 12 or 14 experiments, we could never find an effect for participation. Now, I can jump way ahead to the 90s where we finally solved the problem. But over dinner, there's a group, it's invited membership, Society for Organizational Behavior. And the three of us are sitting there, and Ed was like a detective. So he's firing questions at Miriam, and he's firing questions at me. And rather than have it just be a discussion and you forget about it after a couple of drinks, we said, let's design an experiment. And the ground rules are, what Ed says goes. So if Miriam proposed something and I go, oh, I don't like it, well, and which I did, then Ed could be the arbitrator. And similarly, if I propose something, Miriam said, I disagree. Well, Ed was the arbitrator. So it went relatively well. Experiment 1.
Before you get to that, this is even more interesting. So in order to do more detective work, I called Miriam's coworker.
Oh, I don't think you should tell that part yet. You should save that. It's a great punchline. Yeah, it's a punchline. Boy, you've just seen us in our first argument, but look how we resolved it.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, first experiment explains nothing. Second experiment explains nothing. Well, now we're really scratching our head. So Sherlock Holmes here decides to contact her research assistant because Miriam wasn't doing the experiment. Her research assistant was. And the research assistant was a person you probably never heard of, Christopher Early. Now.
So I called him, and you know, because of the method section has to be a little condensed, everything that happens in an experiment is not in the article. It's not. And that happens, by the way, in medical research. Most medical research publications cannot be replicated by the drug companies. They're very upset about it because there's all kinds of, it's so complicated, everything isn't in there. So I said, Chris, tell me everything you did. And we discovered that there was a difference in instructions. And Miriam's subjects were told what? Forget now.
Well, we were going down the wrong path. The assumption was that how Miriam engages in participative goal setting, and by the way, she was very much influenced by kibbutzes in Israel, and the way I was engaging in participative goal setting were different. Wrong. We were both doing it the same ways. We never would have guessed. We had 7 possible explanations. And the one that was the explanatory variable wasn't one of the ones we initially hypothesized. It had to do with the way we assigned goals.
She demonstrated, and I can't validate what I'm going to say, but she showed that consciousness is an axiom of philosophy and psychology and cannot be done away with. It cannot be done away with. And it leads to contradictions if you try to do it. Secondly, a second axiom in objectivism is reality is real. Now, this sounds kind of abstract, but it was a guiding principle of my whole career. Reality is real means facts are facts. And it doesn't matter how much you wish they were different. They're real. So when I was confronted by a negative result, I asked myself, is that true? And if so, why did that come out that way? It enabled us to add some more moderators and mediators to goal-setting theory. So that was, in Hertzberg, the axiom was, agree with me or else. It was a devastating effect on him, and he withdrew from the field. Reality is an absolute. So that was always the primary in my whole career. Reality is real, and never be supplanted by some psychological motive. Third was real self-esteem is not based on being right or fame or other things. Real self-esteem is based on using your mind rationally. Self-esteem that can't be threatened by anyone because it's in your control. Use your mind to focus on reality and make the best judgment you can. And so I didn't get threatened if something didn't come out because my self-esteem wasn't based on that. If they came out with a valid thing, okay, maybe we have to change goal-setting theory. I'll give you an example of this later. Third, the importance of clear definitions and valid concepts. This is a mess. This is a mess for decades. EQ, mindfulness, organizational self-esteem, nobody knows what those mean because the concepts are not clear. So I push on this all the time, clear concepts. I even have a chapter on it in one book of readings. Fifth, virtues. One of her virtues, her most fundamental virtues, is rationality. But an aspect of that is independent thinking. Independent thinking is very rare, especially among academics. Very, very rare. So I never kowtowed to peer approval. I just didn't care. I'm going to say what I think honestly and politely, and I wasn't going to go along with the peer group if I thought they were mistaken. And that has been a huge help to me because so many things are accepted, such as the journal policy of theory first, deductive hypothesis, and results as a way of theory building, which I think is totally wrong. Number 6 is the importance of induction. I can't go into details, but that motivated me for an inductive approach to learning, concept formation, and theory building. So I really, really feel that her philosophy benefited my life in my career.
How about you, Gary? Who are your intellectual heroes?
Well, it's an interesting question because in every class that Ken Wexley taught us, he asked that same question. Who are your heroes? Who are your role models? Now, just to remind you, again, I had 2 years at the American Pulpwood Association between my master's and my PhD. So when Uckel and Wexley would assign the readings, I literally devoured them in terms of application. How could I use this? How could I use this? How could I use this? So in performance appraisal, it was people like Herb Meyer and Mal Sorcher. In training, we had to know backwards and forwards, McGehee and Thayer. And that bad guy Thayer's right there, and I had to read and reread just because Thayer wrote all that stuff. So, Paul, raise your hand, you miserable person. In motivation, there was a young guy who had just come out, and he enthralled me, and that was Ed Lawler. And then to show you what a fun guy I was, on weekends I would go to the Georgia Tech Library and I would read psychological abstracts. And that's how I came across another young guy by the name of Ed Locke, just through reading the psychological abstracts. So my heroes were, oh, and then another hero I've already mentioned. I was fascinated by Rensis Lickert's work. So I was always thinking, how can I use this? How can I use this? And for those of you who are getting ready to study comps, it's just impossible to memorize and get all that stuff crammed into your brain. But if you're constantly thinking about how can I use this, it's amazing how you can remember so much. And I got through comps first time around.
So do you have any words of wisdom to new academics?
All right. We're going to make this last part very short because I know you have questions, so I'll be quick. Don't compare yourself to others in terms of outcomes. Big mistake. You'll feel inferior your whole life because there's always somebody better than you. You can admire people for their virtues. That's good. But don't copy other people's outcomes. Use role models for that purpose. I never had a goal for publications, believe it or not. My goal was to always have about 5 things going at once. That was my goal, because I loved it. So my last piece of advice is be sure, if you're going to be an academic and publish or perish, that you love what you're doing. Because I really do. I mean, I've been publishing more since retirement than before. I love it, and I'm good at it. It's not just why, but I love it. So if you don't like it, then don't do it. My current wife was a PhD at Maryland, started teaching, didn't like it. She said, I can't give it up. I said, I feel guilty. I spent all this time. I said, give it up. Do something else. She's found another thing that she loves. So it's really important to be passionate about your career. Find something you personally, selfishly, really, really enjoy. And if it's not academia, do something else. That's my advice.
Did you notice he said current wife? I've outlasted one of his, and he's outlasted one of mine. I love you, Ed.
It took me 3 tries to get it right. I've got it right for 15 years, so I'm very happy.
Here's the best advice I ever received. In '74, I invited Ed Fleischman to come to Weyerhaeuser to talk on leadership. Fleischman at the time was the president of Division 14. We weren't SIOP in that era. And the editor of JAP. Here's what he said. Give your papers to your enemies. They'll be glad to point out their faults. If you give them to your friends, Gary, they'll just say how good they are. So to turn it into a principle, embrace and thrive on criticism. Better you get shot down before you submit the paper and then wait 3 months or longer for the editor to send back the rejection. Send them to your, so I'll just tell you how I put it in practice. I'll write, dear so-and-so, attached is, because it's email now, attached is an article on, Please critique us on everything from style, grammar, to substance, to analyses. You've got to make the person comfortable. Now, some people are just nice. So I would send stuff to Terry Mitchell, my former colleague and still good friend at Washington. I don't do it anymore. He's nice. I send stuff to Bandora, or the love of my life here on my left. And you know, when it was snail mail and you'd see it's Al Bandora front, I would go, and then I would open it, and sure enough, it was worse than I anticipated. But the papers got published because I had the opportunity now to either do something over or fix or re-explain or clarify. So embrace criticism. Second practical advice for you.
Time for questions.
Okay, I'll give you one more and then time for questions. When you're here at conferences such as this, network with people who are interested in the same area as you. And then you'll be surprised how fast you're invited to serve on symposia, and your career will take off. You'll find that you'll just automatically get mentors. Things just get a whole lot easier when you're in with a circle of people who are interested in the same area as you are. Okay, questions?
By the way, I don't send my papers to enemies because I know more than they do.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor to some questions. Go ahead.
Dr. Locke, nice to meet you. Love goal-setting theory. Great. Also, was kind of a Randroid, I'm Randroid for quite some time. I've kind of moved on, and I was curious if there were any tenets in her philosophy that you moved on from or disagreed with, and how that's impacted you.
So the question is, there any tenets of Ayn Rand's philosophy that you moved on from or had issues
No, I
with?
don't like the idea of that. People say I outgrew it. I don't agree with that concept. I've actually learned more and deepened my knowledge and agree with it even more after 50 years.
Next question. Yes, go ahead.
Do you take on different roles when you work together? Like, is one of you, you were saying one of you is more the theorizer and the other one is more documenting science. Do you see that as you're working together?
So I'll repeat the question so it goes on the recording. So do you take on different roles when you're collaborating?
Let's both answer. Okay. My answer is that it depends on who starts it. Typically, the person who starts it writes the first draft. Send it to the other person, they make comments, then they go back and forth until they're both happy. So go ahead and add.
That was mine. You know, if you look at Ed's Vita and you look at my Vita, the number of Locke and Latham and Locke's are relatively few. We're really, I think, in everybody's mental set because we write these conceptual papers. And although he and I have never articulated, I'm articulating it now for the very first time. Generally, if I get asked, I then phone Ed and say, do you want to be the co-author? And when Ed gets asked, he phones me and says, hey, do you want to be the co-author? And then just as he said, one takes the lead and just completes the entire paper and then sends it to the other. And we are extremely good at critiquing one another's work, which is a plus. As I said, I used to say we've never had a paper that didn't get accepted. I had forgotten. So now we're batting 9 out of 10.
35 out of 36.
Yes, go ahead.
Knowing so much about goal theory, did you apply goal-setting theory to your life and to your publication process that you set for?
Oh, I got to answer this one.
So the question is, have you applied goal-setting
I think
theory
I already
in
answered
your
it.
life?
I answered it for myself anyway before, but I'll repeat it. But let Gary go now.
I was invited to give the opening keynote address at the inaugural Australian I.O. Psychology. I think it was around 95. Again, there's about 500 people in the audience. And someone asked your question. You teach, you do research, but do you practice? And I was about to give my answer when my wife, who's in the front row, leaps up, turns to the audience and says, "He sets them daily before he even gets out of bed. He makes me crazy."
So, as I said, my goal was to have 5 to 7 articles in process at all times when I was full-time. And then sometimes a deadline for bringing a particular one to conclusion because everything was in. But I did not have a goal for a number of 300 articles because I didn't want to sacrifice quality for numbers. I never wanted to do that. So I didn't want to set a goal then. So I had a meta goal of doing good work and then a specific goal of keeping stuff going because I loved it. So we all don't have to work the same way. Sometimes I would set written summer goals when I had the summer off, finish these 2 things. But otherwise...
I've already set a goal, did it this morning, for a paper I'll complete by a week Friday.
I'm retired and I'm lazier.
So who else has a question? Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Locke, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to know, because goal-setting theory has been one of the things that has endured, do you see any other theories that are current or newer you think will endure the test of time as well?
Well, of course, I don't read all... You want to repeat the question?
So the question is, are there any other theories besides goal-setting theory that you see emerging or as approaching importance?
First thing, a lot of what people call theories are not theories in our sense. They're just a couple of things with an idea. But I call that a hypothesis, not a validated theory. Now, of the validated work, we tie in best with Bandura, who's the most famous psychologist ever, the most rewarded, the most esteemed, and deservedly so. And I have a good relation with him, and Gary has a good relation with him. He's 90 years old, and he's still publishing. Totally amazing.
And so he's Canadian, by the way.
He's Canadian. And I have tremendous respect for his self-efficacy work. So, and that's part of goal theory, and goal theory is part of self-efficacy theory. So it's not fair for me to comment on other things because I don't keep up in all the others. I mean, I know a little bit about stuff, so I'll leave that to others to judge.
Yeah, I'll answer your question. I wrote a book you may be aware of a few years back on motivation theory in the workplace. And I think organizational justice theory will endure.
By the way, justice is one of Ayn Rand's core virtues. So I'm very much pro-justice.
Yes, you have a question?
I want to hear your thoughts on latent goals, like goals you don't necessarily say yourself. We were reading about, by the way, I'm a first-year graduate student, so we had discussion in class about latent goals, and we read about article in 1996 from Austin and Vancouver on latent goals, and he used the example of body temperature, saying that we go reach to get a code because we have this latent goal of maintaining a body temperature. Me and some of my fellow graduate students don't kind of agree that is a goal just because we don't agree with it. So I just want to hear your thoughts.
So the question was about what are your thoughts on latent goals?
Okay, let me tell you a little about Vancouver, okay? I don't send my articles to Vancouver, and he doesn't send his articles to me. We're on different philosophy. He sees consciousness as being a huge problem for science. He doesn't like it, does not like consciousness. So control theory is an engineering model, tries to relabel thoughts in terms of engineering concepts, which we've criticized numerous times. That's why it's totally off. Notice Vancouver doesn't ask people what their goals are. He doesn't like it. So he's okay with the subconscious because it's automatized. You don't have to ask questions about it. So he and I are, I call him a kind of neo-behaviorist. So he and I are in a different universe. Now, in my article in PPS, I acknowledge what the subconscious is, and it's real. It's a storage facility. Think of it as an Amazon warehouse. It just as a metaphor. And it stores trillions of things, of bits. And without that storehouse, you're dead, okay? Your conscious mind can only hold about 7 things at once. But the conscious mind is active. What the conscious mind does, if you want to go back to the Amazon, it puts in an order. I want a can of tennis balls. Amazon, the subconscious feeds them up and delivers them to your door. So your conscious mind is your volitional aspect. Your conceptual faculty is your aspect of volition. So if you use it, it sets the terms for how your subconscious works. It decides what gets stored. It validates or invalidates. It integrates. It helps interpret your emotions, which are based on the subconscious. So the conscious mind, if you choose to use it, guides your life. If you don't use the conscious mind, which all of us use every day, all day, your subconscious takes over. And you'll just flitter and float randomly. You won't have a human life at all. So, yes, you can have subconscious tendencies to suddenly buy ice cream. Okay, but how did you get to the grocery store? You chose to drive there, chose your car, chose the route, chose the fact that you're going to go shopping this morning, chose how you're going to pay for it. Yeah, you can do impulsive things. But if impulses can't guide a human life long range, you're dead if you do that. So you need the conscious and the subconscious both, and you need them working together. You need them working together.
So I think we have time for one last quick question. Go ahead.
So you mentioned control theory as one of the things that is pushing towards a neo-behaviorism.
Oh, it's an engineering theory.
Yeah, engineering theory, yes. But do you have any other things that you see encroaching into our realm that are also reflecting a return to behaviorism?
Yes, the push toward subconscious priming, and I'm not against priming because Stakovic and I did the first priming study in JAP, and Gary's done a whole bunch, so I'm not against priming. But some of the priming fanatics say, such as who's the guy? Barge, will write in a national article, the conscious mind doesn't have much effect on your life. Everything you do is guided by the subconscious. This is ridiculous. You couldn't survive for a day if that were true. Priming is real. I've done it, he's done it. Priming involves some conscious factors, which they don't talk about. But to say priming rules your life and you're just an automaton is preposterous. Just preposterous. The Barge should know better. Even though the research may be okay, should know better than to make statements like that. It's a gross overgeneralization of your subconscious. Because if you don't have a subconscious, you're dead. And if you don't have a conscious mind guiding your life, you're dead. You need them together.